All you fine folks, good to see you this evening. Would you join me in a moment of prayer to begin? Father in heaven, we give you thanks for the privilege of coming to worship. We pray that we may remove the things of the world from our minds and focus out on you, on your word, and study it in ways that will help us live our everyday life. Be with us as we live, that we can always be a shining example to you. And we look forward to that home in heaven. In Christ's name, amen. First song. Not the one I picked, but it'll do. We will glorify the King of Kings. We will glorify the Lamb. We will glorify the Lord of Lords, who is the great I am. Lord Jehovah reigns in majesty. We will bow before the throne. We will worship him in righteousness. We will worship him alone. He is Lord of heaven, Lord of earth. He is Lord of all who live. He is Lord above the universe. All praise to him we give. Hallelujah to the King of Kings. Hallelujah to the Lamb. Hallelujah to the Lord of Lords, who is the great I am. My heart, my mind, my body, my soul, I give to you. Take control. I give my body a living sacrifice. Lord, take control. Take control. My heart, my mind, my body, my soul, I give to you. Take control. I give my body a living sacrifice. Lord, take control. Take control. I found my Lord and he is mine. Let me start that again. I found my Lord and he is mine. He won me by his love. I've heard him all my years of time and dwell with him above. His yoke is easy, his burden is light. I found it so, I found it so. His service is my sweetest delight. His blessings ever flow. No other Lord but Christ I know. I walk with him alone. His streams of love forever flow within my heart and throne. His yoke is easy, his burden is light. I found it so, I found it so. His service is my sweetest delight. His blessings never flow. There's another verse that says something. You are dismissed to class at this time. Those are the songs I picked.
See you later, buddy.
No. All right. Okay, we're in the middle of Genesis chapter 31. Jacob was his relationship with his father-in-law was getting more and more tense, also with his brothers-in-law, and God had told him in a dream to return to the land where he came from. And God assured Jacob that he would be with him, and that the promises that he had made would come true. And so Jacob left Laban. In verse 19 of chapter 31, it reads, "When Laban had gone to shear his flock, then Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was fleeing. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the Euphrates River and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead." Now, what was happening? Jacob had fled from his family because he had cheated his brother out of an inheritance and out of a blessing from his father, and he had heard that his brother was plotting to kill him, and he was sent to go to his mother's family, ostensibly to look for a wife, and that when his mother sent a messenger to him and said that, his brother's anger calmed down, I'll let you know when you can come back. Well, there wasn't any message from mom. But Jacob did fairly well. He got a dose of his own medicine. We read about that. At the last minute, the wife he thought he was marrying was switched, and a whole bunch of other things were going on we talked about last time. So there was a lot of tension. And so God told Jacob to go. And there wasn't any warning as to whether he was going into a hostile environment or not. But he was in a hostile environment. And what we're going to see tonight is two confrontations. One is in the rest of chapter 31, where Jacob flees, and I just briefly read that. He fled while Laban wasn't aware of it. And of course, we'll find out one of the things that was happening was Laban was changing Jacob's wages all of the time, and he was suspicious of Laban. As Jacob was leaving, he could very well have said, "Oh, no, you're only going to get the spotted ones. I'm not going to give you the black ones," or whatever it was, and at the very last minute, lose half of his flock. And so he was going to get gone before Laban knew anything about it. And of course, Rachel wasn't exactly dealing honestly either. She stole the household idols. And I mentioned, I don't know whether to mention it now or mention it as we get down to it, but these household idols, Laban and Laban's father and grandfather were all related to Abraham, and they all held to the one true God, but apparently they were also holding to these family idols. Another thing that we found out archaeologically was that a lot of times these household idols represented tokens of inheritance, so that the family member who had possession of those idols was going to be the head of the household and owned the family business. So this was a little bit more serious than, "Well, you stole my gods," but it was also, Jacob could conceivably, Rachel's husband, Jacob, could conceivably come back with those idols and say, "Aha, everything belongs to me," later on after Laban died. That's a possibility if the archaeological story holds true in this time. So this is what was going on. In verse 22, when it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him a distance of 7 days' journey, and he overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream of the night and said to him, "Be careful that you do not speak to Jacob, either good or bad." Laban caught up with Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen camped in the hill country of Gilead. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done by deceiving me and carrying away my daughters like captives with the sword? Why did you flee secretly and deceive me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with joy and with songs, with timbrel and with lyre, and did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Now you've done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your fathers spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful not to speak either good or bad to Jacob.' Now you have indeed gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" And Jacob's going to give his answer here, but you get a sense for what was going on. He says that he wanted to send him away with all sorts of joy, but at the same time he says, "I have the power to beat you up, you know." So something else was going on in his mind, and God knew it, and he cautioned Laban about doing anything drastic. He was going to protect Jacob from violence. And this is something I wanted to point out ahead of time, and we'll notice it as we go. God isn't protecting Jacob from scary stuff. What God is doing, I mean, he's protecting him from harm. You know, he did this by warning Laban, but he didn't protect him from the situation. But what he did do was to reaffirm to Jacob the promises that he made and the reasons that he should have to trust in God anyway. So Jacob was going to be pushed into these scary situations. Here it is with Laban, and then later with Esau. He's in these situations, but God is using these different methods to shore up Jacob's faith when he approached them. And so Jacob would be encouraged, and he wouldn't panic when it all took place, or he had a reason not to. And I think God does that sometimes with us. He measures the trials that we're going to have, but he also gives us reason to trust him when we face that scary stuff. And we need to remember the reasons that we have to trust him when we do face challenges to our faith. And I think it's a good example for us. And of course, like Jacob, we're not perfect and deserving of all of this protection. It's because of God's graciousness and love that we get it, and that he has plans for us, just as he had plans for Jacob. He had reminded Jacob, "I'm going to be with you. I want you to go, and I'm going to be with you." So he had that to hang on to, and he had those promises to hang on to. And here was Laban coming with his armed force, kind of threatening violence, but saying, "Well, God told me not to." And so here he is, and Laban is really incensed about this, these stolen gods. Just a little side point, but it's worth considering. About 1,000 years later, Isaiah mocks the whole idea of idolatry and what idols are really nothing. And one of the things that he talks about is the destruction of, I believe it's Assyria, or wait a minute, no, I forget now whether it's Assyria or Babylon, I forget. But the idea is the Babylonians' gods were being carried away in an ox cart, and the ox carts were straining under the load. And the implication he was making is, well, shouldn't your gods be protecting you rather than you trying to protect your gods from being stolen? And we have that right here. I mean, you have these gods They're your household gods, but they can't protect your household, can they? They can't protect themselves from being stolen, so what good are they? Not very much. Maybe he also realized maybe the big concern here was an economic one rather than a religious one. If he had any brains, he would say, well, if these were really gods, then they can't protect very much or do very much. If they can't protect themselves from being stolen, how can they protect my other goods from being stolen anyway? Anyway, that's a little aside here, but it sort of goes in. Laban was incensed about this, and he wanted them back. And so here is Jacob's answer, verse 31. Jacob replied to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. The one with whom you find your God shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what is yours among my belongings and take it for yourself. For Laban did not know that Rachel had stolen them. And so Jacob was saying, hey, go and look. Go and look. I'm giving you a search warrant. Go and look. But he didn't know Rachel was the one that stole them, you see. And, of course, here's the tension, because Laban's going through everything, rummaging around, trying to find those idols. And Rachel hides them. I'll paraphrase this so I won't have to read every single word. But she hides them in a camel saddle and sits on it. And so when Laban comes through her tent, she excuses herself for not getting up, saying that it was the time of her period, and that she couldn't rise before him. And of course, Laban, would be kind of reluctant to try to go through the camel saddle that she's sitting on. So he searches everything else and doesn't find the idols, and it's relief. I got away with it time. And so he comes back. He comes back to Jacob, and then Jacob vents his anger at this whole proceeding. Now, he is in the right in that, seemingly in the right. He doesn't know that the guy's idols were stolen. He is in the right in leaving, and he is in the right as far as really sneaking out because he's likely to get gypped. But he wasn't exactly always dealing honestly with Laban either, was he? I mean, he was trying to jig things up so that he'd get the larger portion of the wages and all of that. And there was this contest over the wages that was going on. Yes, Rex.
I read this one time, I don't know.
Uh-huh.
But 1 Samuel 19:13 talks about Michal, David's wife, hiding a household idol in the bed where David slept. So it must have been large. My understanding of what they were writing was saying that they didn't look at certain idols like they looked at other idols. There was an idol that may have been what she's stealing that was a sickness amulet-like thing. Mm-hmm. That when you got sick, you put it in the bed with somebody, and people would hold on to that, and it made them feel comfortable. And that was one type of idol. That wasn't the type that you went and bowed down to or all like that. Mm-hmm. More like what we would call a rabbit's foot. Yeah. That people miss and stuff like that. That may be one of the explanations. At least that was the explanation the guy gave that I read.
Okay. If I remember right, I read it a while ago. I think it was Joseph Freed's book that I was referring to, but I would imagine there were different kinds of localized idols. And we're going to see that, we'll see that throughout the Old Testament. Periodically, later on, Jacob's going to command everybody to get rid of their idols. But they were supposed to be worshiping the one true God, but they had them, and they were commanded to get rid of them. Later, Moses would tell everybody to chuck out their idols, and then periodically those things would start creeping in again. So there were still these superstitious things, whether they were full-fledged gods or whether they were talismans or, tokens They were playing with it.
You mentioned Moses, the thing that they looked at to where the Sphinx could have turned into
Yeah,
one.
that's right.
So, it's what you do with it.
Exactly. So it's kind of funny. I'll segue into this and then back to the text. It's kind of funny. The Jewish people got to start thinking that they were such hot stuff because they were God's chosen people. And they had the law, and they were so wonderful, and they were so holy, and all of this. And if they read their own history, it would sort of like being that Finding Your Roots program on TV. I don't know if you ever watched that, where celebrities would go and they would find out, who your relatives were in ancient times. And of course you find out there are presidents and kings, and then there are horse thieves and slave traders. And so you think about a puffed up Pharisee talking about how wonderful it was to be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you take a look at what these guys are doing, and you take a look at the idols they had to throw out, and that later on we're going to be seeing murders and rapes and incest and all sorts of stuff going on. And then all of a sudden you think, well, do you really have that much to brag about having that ancestry? Why not just, brag about God and his mercy in spite of all of this stuff? And that's really the way we ought to be. That's the way we ought to be as Christians too, right? Yeah. Rex?
Well, it's one other thought, and that is that remember Jeremiah, they turned the temple into an idol, thinking that they couldn't be destroyed because they had the temple. They didn't worry about God. It was the thing.
Yeah. Well, part of idolatry is to make a God you can control, who has rules that you make up rather than what God wants. And it's trying to obtain some kind of spiritual power over something, and it's not submitting to the one Spirit who created everything and relying on his power. So anyway, back to our text here. Jacob, apparently being cleared of theft, unloads on Laban. Jacob became angry and contended with Laban, and Jacob said to Laban, "What is my transgression? What is my sin that you've hotly pursued me? Though you fell through all my goods, what have you found of all the household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two." He's in the right? He's all hyped up. "And these 20 years I've been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. That which was torn of beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. You required it of my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was. By day the heat consumed me, and the frost by night, and sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you've changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands. He rendered judgment last night." And he was probably right about that. He was probably right about all of that. He was very self-righteous about it, not admitting that he was also had some guile in this thing too, but it was probably accurate. Sometime, and then we read in verse 43, and then I'll stop for a minute and I'll paraphrase again. Laban replied to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine. What can I do this day to these my daughter, or to their children whom they have borne? Now come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. And so what they did was they made a peace treaty, and they set up a pile of stones and a pillar, and they pledged to each other that they wouldn't cross that line, that border line, to do each other harm, and that Jacob would swear that he wouldn't take any other wives and that he would treat his wives decently. And that was the treaty that they made. And it wasn't exactly like, oh, we're all palsy-walsy now. It was more like, we're not going to try to kill each other, kind of a peace treaty. It was God's a witness, and they were promising not to do each other harm. And then they had a meal together, which was a sign that they're making everything okay. And then Laban went his way. Notice Laban's attitude. The daughters are my daughters. Well, yeah. But now they're Jacob's wives. But he still has the strings. You say, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. You know, he's thinking, well, Jacob came there with nothing, and now he's coming out with all this stuff, and that stuff was mine. It's sort of like that 20 years of service didn't count for anything. Sometimes people get that way. I don't know if you've ever encountered it that way, but sometimes employers don't appreciate the work that you put in, that it has value over and above what the product is. That part of the value of the product comes from the labor. Sometimes, I don't know if you ever encountered it in your personal life, but sometimes somebody would give you a gift, a relative would give you a gift, and there's a spring on it or a string on it, and like, you know, your father-in-law gives you a table saw, and he sort of pokes around and he finds out that you're not really using that table saw very much, but Uncle Vinny needs it a whole lot more, so he decides to take the table saw and give it to Vinny instead, even though he gave it to you. But really what it is the gift is sort of a long-term loan. And there may have been this kind of possessiveness that's going on in Laban's mind with this whole business. Yeah, I'm giving you these flocks, but they're really my flocks. You have them to use, and so on. But and he had to have his fingers pried off of those things, and his heart pried off of those things, and certainly this pillar helped to make the separation more permanent, which was good for both of them, really. Any comments on this particular thing? You know, the need, really, it's part of this need. A man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Well, it's assumed that the woman leaves her family and goes to the husband's family. Of course, this is the opposite way. The husband stayed with the woman's family, but the principle remained the same. There wasn't really a leaving and cleaving. The leaving wasn't on Laban's part. The leaving wasn't really leaving, and there's all sorts of issues going on with that. And it works that way today. You really need to be prepared to, you get married, you're one unit. It doesn't mean you don't respect your parents. It doesn't mean you don't take advice from your parents, but you belong to each other. And the in-laws don't need to be stirring the pot with their fingers thinking that they still control you because you're the kids. There has to be that leaving going on for a marriage to really work. Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting, they both had a name for the location.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't even agree on the location.
Yeah. I do think, though, part of it was a difference in the local dialects, because one called it a different name than the other, but the meaning of it was the same. So I suspect Nothing else is mentioned here in the text that maybe Laban was speaking a slightly different dialect than Jacob might have been, but that was my own assumption. It may not be the case. I don't know. Good point. Anything else? Okay, well, Jacob was rescued by God, helped by God through all of this, and that's a piece of encouragement in itself. He knew that God got him out of this bind, and now he had to face Esau, which is even a worse thing, because the last thing he ever heard about Esau was planning on killing him. And so, he needed some bucking up to do this. He had enough courage to trust in God. God said, I will be with you. Here was a demonstration. Chapter 32, verse 1. Now as Jacob went his way, the angels of God met him. Jacob said when he saw them, this is God's camp. So he named the place Mahanaim. Okay, now it doesn't say anything more about this. I don't know. Maybe it's both. I don't know how Jacob would have looked at this. If I were him, I could have looked at it two ways. I try to put myself in his shoes sometimes when I do this. But you see God's camp. You just had this confrontation with your father-in-law who was really angry at you. And on your way to see your brother Esau, here's God's camp, and you're passing by God's camp. Maybe God has a guard set on my back to protect me in case Laban changes his mind. Maybe. I don't know what this army is here for. But God also said he's going to be with me to protect me when I go see Esau. And that's also encouraging to see God's army too. Because God said he's going to protect me, and he's got an army in the territory. So God is giving him some reassurances here in enabling him to see this army of God, a camp of God's angels. And he doesn't mention anything more about it. In verse 3, Jacob prepares to meet Esau. Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He also commanded them, his messengers, saying, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. So he's saying, look, I'm coming back, but I've got more than enough of my own stuff. And maybe the implication here is, yeah, you swore to me the inheritance, and I cheated you out of all of this stuff, but I'm not after all of that stuff anyway because I have enough. It's sort of a reminder that, I've got my stuff. And he doesn't phrase it that way. He just says that he has lots of stuff. So he's not coming like a beggar. He's not coming like he's going to be claiming anything special, although he doesn't clearly say it. And he's asking, look, I want your favor. I want your forgiveness. So this is what the messenger had to say. And the messenger came back, and it wasn't such great news. The messengers, verse 6, the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and moreover, he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. That's an army. That doesn't sound like the favor of Esau is coming to greet him. He got 400 men. And verse 7, Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people who were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into two companies. And he said, if Esau comes to one company and attacks it, then the company which is left will escape. I've got to preserve what I can preserve here. I got this army coming. And then Jacob prays. He prays to God. In verse 9, O Lord my God, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. I'm unworthy for all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he will come and attack me, and the mothers with the children. For you said, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered. So he prayed to God. Notice he was praying for protection and deliverance, but he was also reminding God of all of the things that God had promised him. Now, God really doesn't need that reminder, but Jacob needs that reminder. And Jacob needs to remember that God said that, and he needs to remember that God meant what he said. So when he was praying that, it was a good thing for Jacob's courage, and it was a good thing for God to hear too. Not that God has memory issues. He was praying this, and we are in a situation, we need to remember what God promised us. We need to remember the help that we have been assured of. We need to be reminded of the things that God has told us and the trust that we have in him. And in doing so, it reinforces us. And also, we need to be humble about it. If we go to God, and he said, look, I came here with nothing, and I have all of this, and that comes from you. We need to be humble about it. It's not like, God, if you let me be swept away, this world is going to be in bad shape because I'm not here. That kind of prayer isn't going to work. God exalts the humble and humbles the proud. And we can't go marching up to God and pretend that we deserve his favor, because that isn't true. We may have been promised his protection, but we haven't earned it. And so going to him in this humble way was a good thing. It was the way it should have been with Jacob and God. And so Jacob spent the night there. I think I'll have time to go through this. I may not be able to do all of the lessons, but that's all right. He spent the night there, and he selected from what he had a present for his brother. And I'll just summarize this rather than read it all. I suggest that you do read it. He took out of all of his stuff. He took a large flock of goats. He took a large flock of sheep, a large bunch of donkeys, and a large bunch of camels. And he had them go up in groups, a servant in front of each group. And each servant was instructed to say, when Esau asked, well, what's this all about? And he said, this is a gift from your brother Jacob, that he might find favor in your sight. So he was giving these series of gifts, very extravagant, very large gifts, and sending them ahead of himself and his family, hoping that he might calm down Esau's anger. Yeah, okay, I cheated him out of the inheritance. I cheated him out of the blessing, but maybe I can pay him back. Maybe I can make him know it's worth his while just to make peace with me, and we'll be okay. That's sort of the idea. And so he instructs his servants to do that, and that's where they're going. And then what he did, in verse 22, he arose the same night and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok, and he took them and sent them across the stream, and he sent across whatever he had. And what he did with them too, I think that may be in a later section, but he sent his wives across, starting with his concubine wives, and then his least favorite wives to his favorite wife, and then when it actually came about, he ran up ahead of all of them. It's sort of like maybe some of them can be saved if there's an attack. That was his plan. He did everything he could to protect himself from this onslaught. There was an army coming, and he did that, and then he was alone. And this incident is a puzzling incident for us to read, but I think it speaks volumes to us. Jacob was left alone, verse 24, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh, so the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." And then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I've seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore to this day the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip. Now this passage isn't just about a custom that the Israelites had about not eating this piece of meat. This is more about what was going on between Jacob and God. First he started wrestling this with fellow he thought was a guy. But by the end of the wrestling match, he realized that he was wrestling with God. I don't know how he figured all of that out, but he did. And after his hip was dislocated, he'd lost. I mean, they fought a long time, and it seemed to be a draw, but his hip was located, and now what do you do? I mean, if it seemed to be even Steven, but all of a sudden you're injured and you know you've lost, what do? You surrender? What does Jacob do? He grabs on and says, "I'm not letting you go till you bless me." He realized that he was wrestling with God. And he knew he lost the fight. But he was desperate to get God's blessing. And so God gave him a different name. Israel, he strives with God and prevailed. He got God's blessing because he did strive with God. But he wasn't striving with God because he felt he deserved it. He was striving with God because he had no other place to go. And he was helpless in the face of God, but he wasn't going to let go. Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 5, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The ones who realize they can't do it on their own. The ones that realize they're beggars before God, and the only thing they have going for them is God's mercy and God's blessing. And here he was, defeated, injured hip and all, facing an onslaught of an army that he couldn't even fight against, clinging on to the one he believed to be God, saying, "I need your blessing, and I'm not letting you go until you do, because I need it so bad." And later Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake." They want to be right with God no matter what. They want God to be with them no matter what. And here is Jacob doing the same thing, isn't he? I mean, it's not like, "Well, I've got my plans and I'd really appreciate a little help from you. I'm just not letting you go until you bless me." And God gave him a new name. He admitted his old name was Jacob, heel grabber, the cheater. But now he was no longer that. He'd been humbled. In a way, he'd been converted, maybe not in the sense that we're converted in that there was an end of one life and a new beginning of a new life, but there was a change of heart in Jacob and his relationship to God. And from that point on, he was dependent on God, and he was reminded that he needed to be dependent on God because he had that limp. I don't know how much it hurt him, whether he had arthritis in it or anything else, but he wasn't exactly going to be Mr. Sharp conniver that he used to be. He was a different man. He was a man who wrestled with God and had received God's grace. And really, isn't that a model for all of us? There comes a time when we're challenged and we have to just realize that we have no help except from God, and that we have to accept our helplessness and just reach out to him and hunger and thirst for that right relationship with him and realize the beggars that we are. And then we become sort of like Isaac. We had been a scoundrel, but we're no longer so. We're walking depending on him and being reminded of our dependence. I think that's the big lesson from this. It's confusing how all of it worked out. How does God pretend to be a man? Well, we know how he became a man in Christ, but here's an appearance of God as a man wrestling with Jacob and showing some things and giving him a new name and a new direction. And it happens to us. We really do need to humble ourselves and wrestle with God ourselves. And that's probably a good place for us to stop for now, and we'll entertain questions afterwards, and thank you very much.